Hi, I'm Charlene Collins Freeman. Thank you for joining me for my watercolor and ink tutorial on creating this spring bouquet. The supplies I use for this bouquet include Arches hot press watercolor paper at 140 pounds. My size is 9 by 12 inches. I also recommend having a scrap piece of watercolor paper to practice painting swatches before we start in on the painting. If you will do your drawing in pencil, try to use a 2H or lighter and a kneaded eraser so that you don't scuff up the surface of the paper when you erase. If you are going to add ink to your drawing, I recommend a waterproof black ink pen. I use the Platinum Desk pen. If you're not sure if your pen is waterproof, test it out on a scrap piece of watercolor paper first by making a couple of lines with it, giving the ink a minute or two to dry, and then hitting it with some water and watercolor paint. Make sure that the ink doesn't ghost, or even worse, flood your wet area. For my watercolor brushes, I used a black gold 311 round size 000 and a micro mini pointed round size 10 zeros. You'll need water, a water container, and paper towels. All of my paints are Daniel Smith watercolor paints. I have a lot of colors in this spring bouquet. My colors include green gold, sap green, undersea green, manganese blue hue, cobalt teal blue, French ultramarine, quinacridone gold, quinacridone rose, opera rose, quinacridone purple, and new gamboge. In this tutorial, as in most of my watercolor tutorials, I often refer to the consistency of my paint to try to help students understand just how wet the puddle of paint they are using should be. The terms I use include weak tea, milk, cream, and butter. And here you can see them lined up with the weak tea at the top. This is truly mostly water with just a touch of paint. The next row underneath that is what I refer to as milk. And you could even break it down more and say maybe this is skim milk. A lot of water, but more pigment than weak tea. The next row underneath that is whole milk. And that just means adding more paint to the puddle. The very last row could be considered a creamy paint or a buttery paint, which means the puddle I'm working with is mostly paint with just a little bit of water. It's important to understand these water to paint ratios when we paint because, as you can see here, it really affects how light or dark your paint will appear on your painting. On this sheet of paper, you'll notice that my swatches go from light to middle to dark. These shifts are called values, and understanding how to paint light, middle, and dark values makes all the difference in our paintings, not only to add interest, but also to create a sense of three-dimensional form. When working in other paint media, such as acrylic or oil, you can create different values by adding white to lighten up a color, or adding black or gray or another color to darken. On the other hand, with watercolors, we play with the water to paint ratio to lighten or darken a particular paint. So getting familiar with how much water to use in your paint becomes critical in watercolors. Often I find that students are either using way too much water and creating watercolors that are very light in tone, or they're painting way too dry, and their watercolors end up looking more like acrylic painting. Spending time creating these kinds of swatches and experimenting with how much water to add to different colors will really help your skills and make you much more confident in understanding how to manipulate the water in the paint that you use. So let's get started with a quick warm-up, playing with the values of our watercolor paints. Start by creating a puddle of paint on your palette and add a lot of water to a little corner of that puddle. When you make your swatch, Put down your brush and keep it on the paper. Just go back and forth as you empty out the brush. Then I go back to my palette and I add more paint to that puddle, and it gets slightly darker. Now I need to add more paint from my palette into that puddle to make it even thicker. And you can see that as I thicken up the puddle of paint on my palette, the swatch it creates gets darker and darker. For this last swatch, I just went straight into the palette and I did not dip my brush back into that watery puddle. And here I have my 4 different values for this particular color. This is alizarin crimson, and now I'm going to do a similar swatch with Aussie gold. I start off creating a watery puddle on my palette and painting it. I mix in more paint, and here I realize I didn't mix enough more paint into it. It looks exactly like the swatch above. So I added a bit more Aussie gold to it. For the third swatch, I added yet more paint. And for the last one, I just go straight from the well to my paper. And you can see again the difference, the shift in value that happens by adding more and more paint. Let's do another one. I'm starting off with, again, very watery color. I'm using sap green for this, and I've just added more paint to that watery puddle. Adding more paint now to that puddle. And lastly, going straight from the well to my paper. When I refer to these different swatches as looking like weak tea or skim milk, whole milk, butter, what I'm trying to create for you is a sense of how thick the paint should be that you're painting with. Many artists use these exact expressions, while other watercolorists have other expressions trying to quantify how much water to paint you should have in your mix when you paint. The important thing is that you start to get familiar with this and more confident with adding more or less water. Creating these value swatches will help you master watercolors more than most other exercises. So don't be shy in creating these swatches. You'll understand your colors and your values better and start to master how much water you should be painting with throughout the process of your painting. So now let's begin with our spring bouquet project. This painting was inspired by a photograph I found on pixabay.com. Pixabay.com is a great resource for artists. Most of the photographs on this website are both copyright-free and attribution-free. Here is my line drawing. I used a waterproof ink pen, and I absolutely love the look of ink and watercolor together. If you also want to use ink, be sure that your ink is waterproof by testing it first. You'll notice also that I really simplified what was in the reference photo, leaving out a lot of the elements that were on the table. You should always give yourself permission to modify your reference photo. Remember, that photo is a starting point, just the inspirational jumping off point. Then go in whatever direction you want to for your own painting. So I'm ready to get started. And I'll start off with green gold, which is a very bright lemony green. A little puddle of undersea green, which is a nice dark green. And a puddle of sap green. All of these are at about a skim milk consistency. And I start by painting the tip of the fern with green gold. I'll add sap green as a middle tone and undersea green as a dark tone. It's important when painting florals and landscapes to focus on a variety in your greens. About halfway up the fern, I add sap green to my mix. And then I add undersea green as I work my way towards the bottom portion of the fern where it's tucked in behind all the flowers. Creating a variety is interesting, but also by making it darker where it connects to the rest of the bouquet will give it a sense of depth. Creates a sense of a shadow where it's tucking in behind the flowers. As my puddles dry out, I just add more paint to them. Try to pay attention to if you're bringing a lot of water into your puddles every time you rinse out your brush. This is a common mistake, that we rinse out our brush and then we dip back into our puddle of paint without thinking about all the water that we're now releasing into that puddle. That will have the effect of diluting our paint more and more, so be sure to dry your brush out on a towel. And then I turn my attention to the fern on the other side of my bouquet. And again, with the tip of that fern, I start with bright green gold. Then I add my other two greens into the mix and start painting about halfway down the fern. First with sap green, which is my middle value green, and then where the fern really tucks behind flowers, I add in undersea green, which is dark. I want to let those areas dry, so I'm going to turn my attention to the pink flowers that don't touch any of the green areas I've already painted. I'm using Opera Rose and just picking my way through some of the brightest flowers. Notice on the flower that I'm painting towards the bottom of the bouquet there, I just painted the tips of the petals, and I'm letting that paint soak in a little bit before I come in with a clean brush. I've rinsed it out of my water, I've dried it out on my towel, and it's just barely damp. And I pull down the paint I've already put down into the rest of the flower. That gives me a nice pink edge and a whiter petal underneath it. And I'm just touching a little bit more of that pink paint into this flower. This is another way to do values, that you paint a darker shape first, and then with just a damp brush and no color on it, you pull that paint down. It has the effect of lightening the paint as you pull it down, creating darker tips and a lighter flower. You can see just how watery that small puddle of Opera Rose is on my palette. I paint a small petal with it, and then I go find another flower that's similar color and paint that in. I'm really hopping around looking for dry areas. Unless you want the colors from one flower to bleed into the colors of another flower, you want to be sure you're only painting areas that are completely dry around the shape. And here I'm watering down that paint even more to a weak tea consistency. I touch that weak tea into the tips of this flower and then just pull the paint down. This flower barely has any color in it. I restate the tips with just a little bit more of that weak tea pink. To let these things dry, and so I'll turn my attention to the vase. I want my vase to look like a white vase with a shadow, just like it is in the reference photo. To paint shadows, try to get away from the idea that shadows are mixes of grays or blacks. Instead, use colors that are already in your image. For this shadow, I'm going to use French ultramarine with just a touch of quinacridone purple. And you can see here my mix is definitely at a weak tea consistency. I don't paint it all the way to the edges either. I want some of the edges to be just the white of the paper. As I get more confident with the shadow shape, I add a little bit more color, still from that weak tea puddle. I've rinsed out my brush and I'm softening up the edges. I want the shadow edges to be very soft as it transitions to the light parts of the vase. With cylindrical objects, we want the shadow to have a soft edge and not a hard edge. This will give us the sense of a cylindrical object as opposed to a hard-edged object like a cube. I paint the shadow in very watery, and then I stop stroking it or working it. I'll let it dry. If later I find that it needs more color, I can come in when it's completely dried and do a second layer. As I consider which shape to paint next, I'm paying attention to whether it has any wet or dry shapes next to it. Don't get impatient and start painting all the flowers at once or all the leaves at once. If you do, the paint will flow together and you won't have a nice distinct edge between shapes. Sometimes having colors run together and go across shapes can be quite beautiful. That's referred to as a lost edge. But if the entire painting has lost edges and it's hard to make out where one flower ends and another one begins, it can start to look a little bit messy and confusing. Here I'm using very watered down quinacridone purple with just a touch of quinacridone gold into it, which mutes down that really loud purple. And I'm painting around some of these flower shapes that are lighter in color. In the photo, some of these are actually white. Instead of leaving them white, I've decided to paint them as yellowy flowers with purpley shapes. Both my yellow and my purple in these flowers is at a weak tea consistency. I want these colors to be really light. With some of these flowers, I'm fine painting right up against them even if they have wet flowers next to them and having there be a little bit of a lost edge as maybe the colors from one flower flow into the other one. For the smaller white flowers, I decided to do the shadow with a very weak tea version of cobalt teal blue. I really love using watered down blue colors as shadows for white subjects. If your mix is thicker than weak tea, you'll run the risk of it looking more like a blue flower rather than a white flower with a blue shadow. As I continue to fill in the shapes of the flowers, you'll see that the puddles I'm painting from are mostly weak tea consistency, maybe getting a little bit more towards skim milk in some areas. With watercolors, it's much easier to layer dark on top of light. It's near impossible to layer a light color on top of something you've already painted dark. I go back to painting my greens, picking out different leaves, and making sure that as I paint the leaves, I keep dipping my brush into different puddles on my palette. Sometimes green gold, sometimes sap green, and sometimes undersea green, and mixing them together for added variety. Remember to make them darker green where they tuck in behind other shapes, and lighter green as they pull away and stand out on their own against the background. I allow some of my greens to run together from one leaf to the other. Now that I have most of the light greens and middle greens in place, I want to paint in some of the darker shapes of green. I pick up more undersea green, and this time it has more of a milk consistency, and I add French ultramarine to it. As I study my reference photo, I'm really looking for the shapes that have the darkest green. This will help push forward the lighter flowers. And to add to that sense of a spontaneously painted watercolor, I don't worry too much about staying strictly within the lines I've drawn. That ink drawing will serve as the foundation and can really pull together even a spontaneously painted watercolor on top of it. So I pop around the whole bouquet looking for areas where I can add these darker colors. Even with these dark greens, be sure you keep adding a variety to them. Sometimes add some sap green to it or a little bit more French ultramarine just to get that variety of greens. Remember, the thicker you paint, the darker it will be. Also, the thicker you use that paint, the less it will travel if it does touch up against a damp or wet shape. As I rinse out my brush, I notice that the green from one of the leaves I just painted has traveled too much into one of the white flowers. So I take my soft towel and lightly tap out the green, stopping it from taking over that white flower. You can press hard with your towel, and that will stop it from traveling and will actually completely dry out the area. I pressed just gently because I wanted there to be a little bit of a bleed between that green and the white flower, but not as much as I was getting. So you can control how much or how little of that paint travels into a wet shape by how hard you press down with your towel when you stop it. As I continue to fill in the greens, I'm really paying attention to getting a variety between light and dark greens, but also between the specific paints I chose. Making sure that there's some green gold that's visible, some sap green, some undersea green, and some of the mixes. So you can play with the color, but then you can also play with how much water is in each color. And here, again, I soak up some of the green that's overtaking a flower. With all these greens in place, I'm ready to start painting more flowers. I pick up quinacridone purple, add opera rose to it, and decide it needs more opera rose. That quin purple is really strong, and I want this to be more towards the pink side. As I paint in the flowers and leaves, I'm careful to leave some of the white paper showing through, poking out between flowers or between leaves. Letting some of the white paper show through gives the spring bouquet an airy quality. And it adds to the sense of brilliance that we get with that white paper bouncing back to our eye. If instead you choose to color in every square inch of the floral, not allowing for any white paper to poke through between the different shapes, it'll give your spring bouquet a really heavy look. So try to get in the habit of leaving white specks of paper showing through the different shapes. Now that I've painted in some of the lighter pink flowers, I'm coming in with a slightly thicker consistency of paint, going from weak tea to skim milk and now even to whole milk, and dropping it in here and there into these wet shapes. This lets that darker paint get soft edges as it diffuses into the damp, lighter paint. I create a weak tea puddle of quinacridone gold and start painting in some of the yellowy flowers. I also touch this into some of the flowers I painted earlier with the weak quinacridone purple. If I get too much travel and too much bleeding between them, I just touch them with my towel. If there are hard edges where I want soft edges, for example, those drops of dark pink on the tip of some of those petals, I can come in with a barely damp brush and just touch at them to soften them. I pick up more weak tea cobalt teal blue and paint in a few more shapes of flowers. I want to be sure I leave a lot of these flowers quite light. Enough of this is painted that I'm really just looking around my painting and finding spots I can paint in. I use a variety of the colors I've already used in the painting. You see I rinse my brush out often, and in fact you can see how dirty my water is getting. What you don't see is that every time my brush is off camera, I'm drying it off on my towel. I'm not constantly depositing a lot of water into my paint. I'm ready to paint those yellowy centers in some of the flowers. And for that, I use new gamboge at a fairly thick consistency. I would say it's whole milk going towards creamy. I paint it in with a little dotting motion, almost like a sewing machine motion. I put down paint, I pick up my brush, I put down paint, I pick up my brush. By working these little areas quickly, I make sure that they don't get too mechanical and perfect. I want these to look pretty organic and natural. Water down some of that new gamboge and touch it to the center of the flower that's on the table. My eye is scanning my painting to see what else it needs. And other than just a few brush strokes here or there, this is typically a sign that I'm towards the end of the painting. If you're really looking for the areas that you want to keep painting and the painting's not really obviously telling you, you're probably starting to overwork it. For the final touches in the bouquet, I pick up my micro mini brush. This allows me to paint really small areas between the medium and light green leaves and the dark green shadows to create a real sense of depth between the flowers and the leaves. For this, I'm using a fairly thick consistency of paint. I would say it's creamy to buttery. And just dotting along here and there. Be sure you don't outline everything when you start to do this. This needs to also look natural and organic and not have a lot of straight edges or a mechanical quality to it. For our spring bouquet to look light and airy, we want to be sure we're painting the majority of it with light and middle values. I reserve these dark values for just a few select spots towards the end. And that's why I'm using the micro mini brush. I want these to remain as small little eye magnets of dark paint that lead you through the bouquet. At this point, you might feel that your painting is done, or you might want to add with your ink pen a little bit of a horizon line behind the vase to indicate the edge of a table. I decide to add a little bit of paint using the same colors that are in my bouquet right next to the flowers to integrate it into the background. By creating a watery mix of colors that are already in my bouquet and painting them into the background, I'm giving this bouquet a setting. It's loosely implied. So I used the Opera Rose to do that, and now I'm coming in with thicker new gamboge and splattering in some of the background. This splatter technique might need a little bit of testing before you do it on your painting. If you decide you want to splatter and you've never done this before, get out a scrap piece of paper to practice first. You need the paint to be loose enough to release from the brush when you tap the brush, so it needs to have some water in it. But if it's too watery, it'll evaporate and just look like dirty water on your painting. Lastly, I pick up very watery quinacridone purple with a touch of that yellow into it to mute it down, and I start painting in a very loose shadow. I don't try to paint a shadow that imitates the exact shape of my vase and flowers. I think that would compete too much as a center of attention. Rather, I make it watery with very soft edges. Although my paint has the consistency of weak tea, you can see the hard edge that's between my shadow and white paper. So I rinse out my brush, I dry it off camera, and I come in with that tip and really soften the edge. I want the transition from shadow to the white paper to be soft. And with these last few brush strokes, I've completed my spring bouquet. Here it is completely dry, and you can see how those lighter tones, especially in the shadow, have faded. This is typical with watercolors. The more watery your paint, the more it'll fade as it dries. So keep this in mind when you paint with weak tea consistency. Painting with really watery mixes will allow you to achieve these sort of subtle effects in your watercolors. I hope you found this tutorial enjoyable and useful. And as always, thanks for joining me.